first of all, thank you to Dan for arranging this and for inviting us on St. John's Eve. Tomorrow, as you probably know, is the feast day of St. John the Baptist, which is incredibly apt where this talk is concerned. And thank you all for coming. And because Dan, when he originally got in touch, he said, you know, come and talk about the Templar Revelation and your journey in the discovery of the things that you discovered in the Templar Revelation. So I'm going to start with some unashamed self-promotion, and I don't care. Right. Oh. Right. In fact, I'm going to do that. Yeah, unashamed self-promotion. This is the film of the Davinci Code. That's Clive. Oh, and there's some other bloke in the picture. That's Clive, and there's some woman, and there's that same bloke that gets in the way. And there's us with a director called Ron Howard. Now, you might be thinking, is the woman just going to babble about being an extra? You know, maybe we make a few pennies on the side being an extra. No, this was not actually the point. And in fact, we were the worst, well, speaking for myself, sorry. I was the worst extra in the world. Somebody that we know who was a television producer, he saw the movie and he said to me, you were just so bad. All you had to do was turn and look at Tom Hanks, and you couldn't even do that. He said, you looked as if you were about to order another bottle of wine. And I said, well, I usually am. Yeah, so anyway, you know, that's not like the equivalent of our holiday snaps. There is actually a reason for showing you this. I mean, basically, why am I showing you pictures? Oh, sorry. Welcome, lady. I've just seen a lady. Hooray! But yes, I mean, why am I showing us as very bad extras on the Davinci Code? Well, first of all, just the other real professional extras loathed us on sight because we were teachers' pet, and they had no idea why. You know, we actually had Ron Howard sort of, you know, was seen on the London bus, and he was saying, Lynn and Clive, come and sit here next to Tom, our mate Tom. And Audrey, and, you know, and the other extras going, well, he doesn't know our names. Who are they? And they don't know what they're doing anyway. And we sort of smiled, you know, like you do. And we had our own Winnebago. At one point, we even had an assistant director bringing us coffee. I got used to it. So Dan, you know, just wait on me. But anyway, yes, why? Why were we in the Davinci Code? Basically given cameos. We were not extras as such, we were given cameos. Well, basically, without us, there would not have been the movie. And there wouldn't even been the book of the Davinci Code. It's actually, the whole thing is because of the book, The Templar Revelation. Now in its 21st year, so happy birthday to it. It's come of age. As Dan Brown said under oath in London's High Court, he said, I got everything I needed from the Templar Revelation. And indeed he did, because the first chapter is called The Secret Code of Leonardo da Vinci, 1997 book. Let's get something straight. I mean, when we're talking about the Da Vinci Code, we're not sort of falling down and worshipping it. I mean, and neither are we bitter. No, we're really not bitter. No, I won't hear it said that we're bitter, all right? I mean, not at all, really. Almost never, in fact. No, but the thing is that, you know, Dan Brown was writing a novel. Our book is non-fiction. And so he, you know, quite rightly, he used our book as reference. And indeed, he referenced at the title of the book and 3 other books in the pages of the Da Vinci Code. So we did quite well out of it. Not as well as we could have done, but anyway. But yes, so basically, you know, it worked out, and we weren't, you know, part of the High Court thing where he was being sued for plagiarism and all that. We weren't part of that. What we didn't give him was the sacred bloodline stuff, which we don't agree with. But what we did give him was the whole idea of the lost sacred feminine, the whole idea of the importance of Mary Magdalene, and of course, the hidden clues in Leonardo da Vinci's paintings. Now this is also from the movie, and this here is my Mary Magdalene book. Now what happened was that in between the Da Vinci Code book coming out and the movie coming out, my book about Mary Magdalene came out, and so the screenwriters used that as reference as well. That's the only real book in the entire movie, and of course blink and you miss it, as indeed blink and you miss us on the London bus scene, but you know, you've got no excuse now, you know we're in it, you know, next time you see it. So yes, so there's a lot about Mary Magdalene, but in fact our book, The Templar Revelation, has two main strands. One is about Mary Magdalene, and the other is about John the Baptist, the other great marginalised New Testament figure. And in fact, most people don't even really think about him, but I hope you will after today. We'll be focusing on John, and yes, using the clues that we found in Leonardo's paintings to put forward an idea that, depending on your viewpoint, might be quite shocking. But actually, in a way, we're letting Leonardo speak for himself. And boy, are you going to be surprised, certainly right at the end of the talk. Because what happens is, I'll be doing this, the warm-up for Clive, then Clive's doing his bit, then I come on in the end and do a big reveal. Ooh, and I guarantee you will be quite surprised by that. And if you know what I'm going to say, shh. But anyway, as I said, this is, in a sense, this is also our story, a journey of discovery. And it began with our first book. Templar Revelation is our second book, 1994, Turin Shroud. A bit of a giveaway as to what we're going to say. Subtitle, How Leonardo da Vinci Fooled History. Bit of a giveaway. But anyway, so doing the research for our first book into how, as we came to realise, Leonardo actually faked the shroud, when there's lots more to it than that, obviously, because otherwise there wouldn't be much of a book. But there is. And basically, we had all this stuff that we discovered about Leonardo, and we didn't know very much about him. We're not art historians, which has actually stood us in very good stead, because, of course, we came to the whole thing with completely new eyes. We were like the little boy in the Emperor's New Clothes story. We go, oh, no, the king is naked. We were just looking at everything with completely new eyes. We had no preconceptions at all, and boy, did we make some discoveries. First of all, Leonardo himself. I mean, he was a very secretive man. He was incredibly, well, I mean, obviously he was a genius, everybody knows that. But he wasn't a dry as dust genius, oh no. He was an illusionist and a conjurer and a hoaxer. And everybody who wrote about him in his day said that he was very funny. But also, most people think, well, he was a kind of proto-scientist. So therefore, people think today, he must have been some kind of rationalist atheist. Well, as we hope to show you, that couldn't be further from the truth. We know this because of our very painstaking detective work, using Leonardo's only means of communicating with the future. Now, he was a man who was obsessed with legacy, if you like. He was obsessed with conveying his deepest, darkest, and electrifying secrets to the future. But how could he do that? Especially as, I mean, even to let on that he was into certain things in his day would have meant the flaming pyre, even given his influential friends. So basically, if you think you know all there is to know about what might be loosely termed the Da Vinci Code, then hang on to your hats, gentlemen and lady. Okay, so we're going to look at the paintings. Last Supper, everybody knows Last Supper, and quite a lot of you will know what Dan Brown says about it, that basically this is not the young St. John, obviously not St. John the Baptist, because by the time of the Last Supper, John the Baptist had been executed, he'd been beheaded. But St. John the Divine, young St. John, I mean, basically, it's a woman. You know, I mean, even some quite, shall we say, our most vociferous critics, such as Tony Robinson, for example. Not that I want to talk about him at all, you know, or even mention his name, but you know. But he agrees this is actually a woman. There's also this sort of M shape that created by the composition, which probably gives probably gives away her identity. You know, the spread-eagled M. But you know, some of the traditionalists, and as you can imagine, over the years we've had some interesting conversations, shall we say, with traditionalists over this. I mean, both art historians and theologians and church people. And the art historians say, no, this is just, you know, there's not an M shape, it's just a sort of side effect of the composition. Well, let's think about that. Leonardo, for a start, like a lot of artists, but especially Leonardo, never wasted a brushstroke. I mean, everything he did had a meaning. And he's actually making us look at that composition, especially if we know the Bible story of the Last Supper. Because in the Bible story, it describes the young St. John literally leaning against Jesus, almost cuddling up to Jesus. That's in the New Testament. Couldn't be any more different, could it? So basically, Leonardo is asking you to look at this because there's something here, something about this character that you should notice. So, and the other thing which is interesting is that Jesus and this person are wearing mirror image clothes. So it's like they're each other's other half. But this and the giant M, or as some people say, giant V shape, for ladies' bits, what sort of Dan Brown and Dan Brown's fans have really concentrated on. But actually there's other things in the painting. For example, come round here. This character here, that's St. Jude, patron saint of lost causes, or in this politically correct world, patron saint of hope, but actually patron saint of lost causes. And it's been modelled on the Last Supper by Leonardo himself. Now, this is not us saying this. This is, you know, art historians have known this for centuries. So this is Leonardo, bent double because he was 6 foot tall. But the interesting thing there, surely, is that he's got his back to Jesus. Remember that. Also, in the Last Supper, in the actual story in the Bible, one of the main reasons for having it was for Jesus to instigate the communion. You know, the wine representing his blood, which will be spilt for the sins of the world, and the bread, which will be broken, representing his body, which will be broken for the sins of the world. Where's the wine in front of Jesus? There's no great chalice or cup. There's a glass. I can't even see it because I'm too close up, but sort of somewhere around here, with about that much in. There's little glasses scattered around, but there's hardly any. And the bread, and I checked this out yesterday, just in case I was talking through the top of my head. It's not unknown. But the bread, although there's 2 sizes of bits of bread, but very little of it is actually broken. So, taking together that Leonardo's got his back to Jesus, there's certainly no wine in front of Jesus, and the bread is largely unbroken. Is Leonardo conveying some doubt about Jesus' sacrifice? Almost certainly, in the light of other things. And there's this is St. Thomas. I'm not sure that his identity is terribly significant, but what he's doing is significant, because that is what we have come to call the John gesture, the John the Baptist gesture. Now, it's not unknown in Renaissance paintings, religious paintings. It generally means think of your soul, think of God, think of spiritual things. But with Leonardo, as we came to realise, it refers to John the Baptist. If John the Baptist himself is not in the painting actually doing it, then somebody is using it basically to say, remember John the Baptist. When we first started looking at this painting, we didn't see the significance, but when we saw all the others, which I'm going to be showing you, I don't think there's any doubt, actually, that this means remember John the Baptist, and he's saying it, as you can see, quite threateningly to Jesus. So, as you can see, there's a lot more to the Last Supper than Dan Brown would have us believe. Now, this is John the Baptist, Leonardo's John the Baptist. Leonardo was definitely obsessed with John the Baptist. I mean, this is known. I mean, it's not just us saying this, but it's us saying basically the extent to which he was obsessed. Now, Leonardo, when he died in 1519 in France, he had two paintings hanging in his death chamber. One was the Mona Lisa, and one was John the Baptist. John the Baptist, not commissioned by anybody else, very rare, well, unique for him, just done for himself. And I think you've got to admit it's rather disturbing. I mean, he's sort of leering, isn't he? He's just, rather odd young man. There's something very disturbing about him, but Leonardo's paintings are often extremely disturbing. I mean, Salvator Mundi, anybody? You've seen it? That's disturbing. So, now this is the Adoration of the Magi. And this is, when we started looking at this, I think this is probably where our ideas about Leonardo's true beliefs started to coalesce. The Adoration of the Magi was unfinished. Leonardo didn't finish a lot of his stuff, mainly because I think he was trying to pack so much into them. What could he get away with? But anyway, as you probably gather from the title and the scene, it depicts the famous scene in the New Testament when the kings or the Magi arrive with the gold, frankincense, and the myrrh to give to baby Jesus. Yeah, there you go, basically. Except when you look at it, as I said, with new eyes, it takes on a whole other dimension. Right, so obviously you have, here are the kings and their entourage. Look at them. Look at them. They're hollow-eyed. They're practically skeletal. Look at skulls. I mean, actually, just skulls, some of them. They are just, I mean, like zombies almost, and sort of clawing at the baby Jesus. Oh, and by the way, this young man, sorry, I'll get out of the way. The young man in the bottom right-hand corner, that's Leonardo. What's he doing? He's looking away. And yes, so you have the worshippers of the Holy Family and their entourage are really quite horrible when you look at them. But in fact, there's another bunch of worshippers in this picture. Surrounding this tree, there they are. And they're all of those people are young and gorgeous and vital and healthy. And this tree is a carob tree. It's in traditional iconography, it represents John the Baptist. And next to it is a young man, which you probably can't see from here, you have to take my word for it, is a young man doing that, reinforcing the whole John the Baptist theme. And look, you see, it's above the Holy Family. So you have these basically crumbly creeps, that's quite a good phrase, clawing at Jesus. And you have these young, amazing people worshipping, if you like, the representative of John the Baptist. So that is really fascinating. Because, I mean, now it's not just, oh, he's got a thing about John the Baptist because he was the herald of Jesus and all of that. He's actually saying the roots of that tree and the tree itself go above, into heaven, above the Holy Family, and the worshippers are healthy and young and vibrant, compared to the others. So that's quite a hard-hitting message. But it goes on. Right. Now, on that side is the famous cartoon. Now, cartoon was simply a preliminary sketch for a painting. And but it's because it's so stunning and executed so brilliantly. It's known the world over as simply the cartoon on the left. And it's in London's National Gallery. And for years, if you went in, it was in a side room all by itself, and people sat there and whispered in front of it in hushed tones. And this is the thing that I'm afraid I find very amusing. You know, going into galleries and Leonardo stuff's there, and people stand and talk in hushed whispers in front of his religious paintings, not knowing what he's actually done to them, or what he actually thought of the scenes that he was painting. Well, first of all, John gesture. This is John as a young lad. And this is the younger, slightly younger Jesus. But as I say, Leonardo only had his gift. He only had his artwork to present to us, to the future, his really dangerous beliefs and thoughts. Now look at the baby Jesus. When I say look at it, just the actual visual line of Jesus is serpentine, and the segments on his body, like some kind of reptile. But if you think, I'm just sort of, you know, stretching a point, we'll come to what happened with this painting. But also there's this, which, you know, superficially just looks like Jesus is blessing John and just, you know, touching him. But actually, no, what he's doing is he's steadying his face and his hands back like this. So that's quite interesting, as say John gesture. It's weird. It's a weird artwork anyway. I mean, you know, women are sitting side saddle on each other if that's not impossible. Anyway, the cartoon did not become a full-blown picture, but the nearest we have is this. I can never remember what it's called because I call it Pulling the Ears Off a Lamb. It's the Virgin and Saint Anne, and anyway, it's a long title. Right. So yes, you have the Virgin, and you have the baby Jesus, and a lamb. Right. So there's something odd about this. There was quite a lot of odd things about it, actually, and quite nasty things. In the New Testament, John the Baptist allegedly says, "Behold the Lamb of God," about Jesus, and that's getting everyone to fall down and worship Jesus. The Lamb of God, famous. But he's been taken out of the picture, and it's John who is the Lamb. John has been replaced by a lamb. He was there, and now there's the lamb. So John is the sacrificial lamb. And look, again visually, just as I said, visually, sort of serpentine line of Jesus. But here, again visually, what's happening? Jesus has got hold of the lamb's ears, and his arm is visually cutting across the neck. So what happened to John the Baptist? He was beheaded. Visually, what do you get? You look at that, and it looks like the lamb's head is separate from the body. The lamb is John the Baptist. That's an astonishing thing. So over and over, Leonardo is communicating a very dark heresy here, surely. Now, this is quite something else. This is the famous Virgin of the Rocks. There are two versions, or Madonna of the Rocks. There are two versions. One is in, no laughing at the back, I think you know what I'm going to say later. You might not, but you might, anyway. No, we'll save that for later. This painting is amazing for all sorts of reasons. This is the Louvre version. There is one in the National Gallery. The Louvre version is the really heretical one, which is why we're showing it to you. Right, now, what it was a bunch of monks called the Confraternity of the Immaculate Conception. Please remember the name for when I come back at the very end, because it actually is important. Yes, and these guys wanted Leonardo to depict a scene. Now, it's not a scene from the Bible. It's a scene that was actually invented by the Vatican to cover up, when you think about it, an incredible gap in the New Testament. Because people, you know, when John the Baptist baptized Jesus, certainly at that very moment, he must have had authority over Jesus to do so. He must have been spiritually superior, at that moment at least, to do that. So the Vatican, acknowledging there was a problem with this, invented a story. They invented a legend in which, on the flight into Egypt, the baby Jesus met the baby John the Baptist, and the baby Jesus conferred on the young John the Baptist the authority with which to baptize him in later years. So this is the scene, and, you know, it just looks exactly as you would imagine, Leonardo to do it. Well, it's exactly as Leonardo would do it, believe me. But anyway, there's two major things here, and I'm going to be dealing with the serious bit now. At the very end, something else. But yes, so Virgin, and, you know, because of the nature of the scene, so, you know, presumably the one bestowing the authority here is, that's Jesus, and that's John kneeling in submission, and this is the Archangel Uriel, or Uriel, who is traditionally the guardian of John the Baptist. But wait a minute, the kids are with their wrong guardians. Surely it's Jesus who would be with his own mother, and John would be with his traditional guardian Uriel. What happens to this picture if you see them with their correct guardians? Right, so Mary and Jesus, Uriel and John, and it's Jesus who is kneeling in submission to John. And it's John who is bestowing something. I mean, something with authority, but at the point surely is not what he's doing, it's what he's doing. And that, you know, is an astonishing bit of what is known as Johannite. And as I say, I'll be coming back at the end, you won't get rid of me so easily, to point something else out in this painting. But armed with this emphasis on John, you know, we had to, I mean, we've been through all this and much more, Leonardo's, and we thought, well, you know, Leonardo was a genius, and a lot of geniuses are completely eccentric, and maybe Leonardo was the only person in the world ever to have had this particular infatuation with John the Baptist, and believed that he was superior to Jesus. But then we started to delve, and we discovered, as they say these days, that Johannitism, for that is what it's known, is a real thing. It's a very big, and to conventional Christians, deeply shocking and threatening thing. And in fact, the more we delve, we came to realize that the Johannite heresy has in fact influenced many of the great European esoteric traditions over the years, such as the usual suspects, including the Knights Templar, as Clive will now explain. See you later.
Well, thank you very much. Now, there's an enormous amount to this Johannite heresy and our research into it and all the things we've discovered. So, you know, I can't do justice to it in, you know, we can't do justice to it in an hour's talk. So what I'm really going to give you is kind of, you know, like the headlines and the edited highlights, which obviously is going to be a bit short on detail, but it's just inevitable. So I just want to give you a real flavour for what Lynn and I found as we started with this question of was Leonardo the only one who had this idea? And then looking into other groups, other societies that also shared these views. These views basically being that John the Baptist is a lot more important than Christian tradition has it, because in normal Christian teaching, John's importance is purely as the forerunner, the herald to Jesus. That's it, really. So this idea that John's more important than we're normally taught, and also that he's in some way superior to Jesus, and also this other element that comes across in Leonardo's paintings of actually kind of a hostility that he feels towards Jesus. So we started looking into this whole thing, and we kept finding this Johannite tradition. Well, the church would call it a heresy, we would call it a tradition, almost hidden in plain sight, popping up now and again, behind lots of the, as Lynn says, the usual suspects. Just to avoid confusion, many of you have probably heard the term Johannite before in another context, and this is in esoteric traditions that are based on not John the Baptist but John the Evangelist, Jesus' disciple, with this idea that Jesus passed on secret teachings to the disciple John. Now it's way too complicated to go into here, but in short, what we found was that those traditions, those Johannite traditions, are relatively modern, and unlike the, if you like, the John the Baptist Johannites, we couldn't find any historical antecedents for it. And as you're going to see, we could find some very strong ones for the John the Baptist, the John the Baptist form of Johannitism. And we actually think that this mixture of the Johannite tradition about John the Evangelist is the result of a confusion, probably a deliberate confusion, between the two biblical St. Johns. Why deliberate? Because as I'm about to show you, hopefully, from the very beginning, the church has been opposed to the Johannites, the John the Baptist ones, and for, in the church's own terms, very good reasons. So if you're into John the Baptist, it's a good idea to kind of hide it by blending it with one of the other Johns. So anyway, going through where we find this tradition, the Johannite tradition, popping up, say, here and there in the Western esoteric traditions. Well, it's there, at least traces of it are there in Freemasonry. I mean, Freemasons obviously have a special reverence for John the Baptist. Feast day of 24th of June is an important day. The Grand Lodge of England was founded on 24th of June 1717. There are Masonic oaths, as I understand it, you'll obviously correct me if I'm wrong, that are taken to the two St. Johns, the Baptist and the Evangelist, although the evidence is that it was originally just to the Baptist and the Evangelist was added later. This is just a Masonic banner showing the two St. Johns. But the interesting thing for Lynn and I when we started looking into that is that Freemasons themselves don't know why they have this special place for John the Baptist, because obviously Freemasonry isn't exclusively Christian, so why put an emphasis on a particular Christian saint, particularly if you're not doing it about Jesus as well, you know? And we read a lot of things in Masonic research publications of different Masonic historians debating why and coming up with various theories, but no one's actually ever come up with a really good answer. Lynn and I think it's just something that Freemasonry absorbed from this mystery tradition, and probably has forgotten why. But where did they get it from? Well, one obvious place is the Knights Templar. Obviously some forms of Freemasonry claim a connection back to the medieval Knights Templar, and there are quite a lot of secret societies and esoteric societies around today that claim this heritage from the medieval Templars. And when you look at the really the oldest of those Neo-Templar societies. When I say oldest, this is only going back to, say, the 18th or early 19th century. But there's a recurring legend that keeps coming up to explain how the Templars in the Middle Ages, at the time of the Crusades, came to possess the secrets that they guarded. Few variations on the details, but the basic story is that the original Templar Knights in the Middle East encountered a sect or a society called variously the Church of John, or the Johannites of the East, or Johannite Christians. And it's whatever the original Knights learnt from these people that became the big secret that the Templars guarded and was regarded as heretical by the Church. Now, obviously, these are legends. They go back to the earliest, the 17th, the 18th century. And we always need to be careful about these kind of stories because they're relatively recent, and it wouldn't be the first time in the esoteric world that a story has been made up to conveniently fill a historical gap or create an impressive sounding pedigree for a society or order. But we think in this case we can be a bit more open-minded, because not only is there a connection between the medieval Templars and John the Baptist, but there was just such a sect of Johannite, quote, Christians that was around in the Middle East at the time of the Crusades. The Templars, too, back in the Middle Ages, also had a thing about John the Baptist, and actually, as with Freemasonry, there's no immediately apparent reason for it. The Order of the Temple, its sort of patron saint was the Virgin Mary, and they also, had quite a thing about Saint Michael as a kind of a warrior saint. And there's no obvious reason why they should also have a kind of thing about John the Baptist. But just to pick a few examples, they dedicated a lot of their churches and chapels to John the Baptist, especially in the south of France, which was the kind of heartland of the order in Europe. This is a John the Baptist chapel that the Templars built. Actually, it's in Leon in France, which is actually in the north rather than the south, but it's just one of the more attractive looking ones. So, the Templars also used the Lamb of God symbol, and they used it a lot, but again to signify John the Baptist, the person who said the words, "Behold the Lamb of God," rather than to signify Jesus. The one at the top there is actually from inside the Leon chapel. The bottom image is the seal of the Templars of the Languedoc, which, those Templars used the Lamb of God as their symbol. So did the Templar Master of England, had the Lamb of God on his seal, but actually on the reverse it had the head of John the Baptist, so making the point that to the Templars, that's the lamb symbolism went with John, not with Jesus. The Templars were, of course, famously accused, well, first of all, of denying Christ, but also famously accused of worshipping this idol called Baphomet, this idol in the form of a severed male head. Now, some of the knights during the trials and the suppression of the order actually even told the Inquisition that this idol was the head of John the Baptist, although other knights did give other identities, but some certainly said John the Baptist. And although there are many suggested solutions to the mystery of the name Baphomet, and the word probably incorporates several layers of esoteric meaning, one does link it to the same root as baptism. So again, not only did the Templars have this sort of inexplicable reverence for John the Baptist, they didn't seem to have a thing about John the Evangelist, by the way. So it's not the Johannites they encountered would have been Baptist ones, not Evangelist ones. But not only that, there was a sect around at the time of the Crusades from which they could have got these ideas. and it's actually still around today. And here they are. These fellas are from a people. I don't know whether you call them a tribe or a group called the Mandaeans. I mean, really fascinating people. You know, it's both an ethnic and a religious group. They're the smallest religious group in Iraq today. They're found mostly in the south of Iraq, around the town of Nasiriyah. In the state, you know, the state that Iraq is in at the moment, they are the Mandaeans are very heavily persecuted. They're getting very heavy persecution from fundamentalist Muslims. But because they're not Christian either, they don't get much in the way of help or protection from the West. And as a result of that, the Mandaeans are beginning to disperse around the world. There are now Mandaean communities in Australia, in Florida, in the Netherlands, and in Catford in London. So, and in a way, the shame is that, as I'm about to tell you, you know, these people have survived intact through all kinds of persecutions for at least 2,000 years. And in some ways, the tragedy now is, as they're spreading out into the world, the younger generations are actually losing interest in the religion. So, you know, having kept something alive for so long, it's beginning to be lost now. So the Mandaeans are an absolutely fascinating people with a fascinating, if tragic, story. They're the world's only surviving Gnostic religion. The word Manda, which is the root of Mandaean, actually means gnosis. Their priests are called Nazareans, which many of you know that Nazarene, as in Jesus the Nazarene, doesn't actually mean of Nazareth. It's a mistranslation. It rather means Nazarene, which was a collective term used for a number of related sects that existed at the time of Jesus and John the Baptist. Now, the Mandaean religion, it's a very complicated and, has to be said, confused one, because it incorporates lots of ideas and influences from many places that they've absorbed during their long centuries of wandering. And they've been wandering for millennia. But their religion centres on the ritual of baptism, which you can see on the left there. They perform it in pools of water. It's got to be flowing water, though, which they call Jordans. They also, interestingly, in their various rites and ceremonies, they make great use of ritual handshakes, which you can see on the right. As far as I know, nobody's done a real study of those handshakes, but it would be, I think, enlightening to do that. The Mandaeans' great teacher and prophet is John the Baptist. One of their sacred texts is actually called the Book of John. But they don't think of John as their founder, because they trace the origins of their religion back much further, in fact, to ancient Egypt. But John happened to be their leader at a particularly significant and particularly traumatic time in their history. But what do they think of Jesus? Well, the answer is not much. They loathe Jesus, they despise him, because they regard him as having betrayed John, of having usurped John's position, of taking over John's following and filling the place that should rightfully have been John's. In the words of one of their sacred books, Jesus perverted the words of the light and changed them to darkness, and converted those who were mine and perverted all the cults. They regard Jesus as a false prophet. They call him the lying Messiah. So, we never heard of the Mandaeans when we started out on this research. They're a bit more known now, but at the time there wasn't a lot written about them. But what's really surprised us, to say the least, was that the Mandaeans, who were supposedly unknown to Europe until the 17th, maybe 16th century, seem to have basically the same attitude to John the Baptist and to Jesus and to their relationship that Leonardo da Vinci had and expressed in his paintings. So I'm thinking, well, is that a coincidence, or could the ideas of the Mandaeans have been brought to Europe, and if so, how and when? So what do historians know about the Mandaeans and where they came from? Well, there's no doubt they originally came from the area we now call Palestine. Their language is derived from Aramaic, the language that was spoken at the time of Jesus, and that they left that area about 2,000 years ago. And then over the centuries they were displaced east and then south by different waves of persecution, first by Christians, then by Islam. So while they ended up in a fairly confined geographical area, well, certainly at the beginning of this century. But the Mandaeans were much more widespread and much more influential in the past. For example, Mani, the founder of Manichaeism back in the 3rd century, that great Gnostic heresy, was probably brought up in a Mandaean community. Mandaeans also appear in the Quran under the name of Sabians. But the really important point for us here is that Mandaean communities were definitely present in areas of the Middle East, in the very same cities in which the Crusaders and Templars were active. So some kind of contact between Templars and Mandaeans isn't just possible, but likely. Doesn't prove that the Templars adopted the Mandaean belief, but they would certainly have met. So okay, that's a interesting set of connections. Can we push it back any further? Where did the Mandaeans get their idea about John and about Jesus from? Where did they come from? Did they have any real historical connection with John the Baptist? As you can guess, the answer is yes. But this is where what I'm about to say is not just from Templar Revelation, but is also material from a book which was kind of the sequel to it, called The Master of Christ, which we've got. Unfortunately, I've only got 2 copies over there. So I'm doing a bit of both books here, because after we finished Templar Revelation, obviously we carried on the research and we found out an enormous amount more. So where did the Mandaeans come from? Well, Arab writers in the 8th century said that the Mandaeans were descended from a sect known as the Dosithians. The Dosithian sect, it's also known from Christian writings up into the 6th century, so 5 centuries into the Christian era. And in those writings, the Dosithians are condemned as heretics. Dosithians named after their founder, Dosithius, and they're condemned as heretics because they worship John the Baptist. They worship John the Baptist as the, quote, righteous teacher. That obviously makes sense with the connection with the Mandaeans. But there are even earlier Christian writings about this Dosithius character who founded this sect, which makes some very extraordinary claims, and not just about him. There's one of the most important texts. There's a whole kind of group of related texts here, but the most important one is something known as the Clementine Homilies, and I don't have to go into why it's known as that. But, this text was written about 150 AD, so about 100 years and a bit after Jesus' time. Although some scholars believe that it uses sources that actually went back to the earliest days after Jesus' crucifixion. In fact, some of the same sources that the author of Acts of the Apostles used. And this text, the Clementine Homilies, states bluntly that John the Baptist's following had continued after John's death, and that his followers believed that he, not Jesus, was the Christ, the Messiah. And one of those disciples, one of John's actual disciples, was this Dosithius character. And in fact, obviously much later images. That's Dosithius, apparently, on the right. So with what we know of the Dosithians, this shouldn't surprise us very much. But these same documents, these same texts, make a claim that is much more surprising, because they say that another much more notorious heretic, and a much better known one, was also a disciple of John the Baptist, and this was Simon Magus. Simon Magus, who the early church regarded as the first heretic, in fact the founder of all heresies. Now this text, written by early Christians, actually presents Simon Magus, and not Jesus, as the person who John the Baptist appointed as his successor, as leader of his movement. Just as a quick aside, what they actually say, this text, is that leadership, after John died, leadership temporarily went to this Dosithius character, because although Simon Magus was the designated successor, at the time John died, he was actually away in Alexandria in Egypt. And I'll come back later to the significance of Alexandria. Now this apparently bizarre claim is actually supported by quite a lot of independent evidence that I don't have time to go into fully, unfortunately. But very briefly, there are very clear points of contact between what Simon Magus taught and did and what Jesus taught and did, especially the teachings as given in the Gnostic Gospels rather than the New Testament ones. And Simon Magus also famously worked with an ex-prostitute named Helen, who several scholars have seen in the same relationship between Simon Magus and Helen, the same relationship as between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. All really fascinating stuff, but that's really kind of for another talk. And it's clear that the reason that the early church hated Simon Magus so much was because he was so much like Jesus in so many respects, and therefore threatened to undermine the kind of uniqueness and specialness of Jesus that the church wanted to everyone to believe. But of course, if Jesus and Simon Magus had the same teacher in John the Baptist, it wouldn't be that surprising that they had the same. Also, according to the Clementine homilies, the reason for the early church's anxiety was that the John sect was using Jesus' own words against the early church in support of their claims about John, because this text says the followers of John the Baptist, this sect, actually argued that Jesus himself had declared that John was, quote, greater than all men and all prophets. So, at the very least, these texts, such as the homilies, tell us that in the earliest days of Christianity, and really for the next 500 years, there was a rival sect or a rival religion that believed John was the one. But they also, of course, say the sect went back to John the Baptist's own disciples, and therefore in some way to John himself. How much truth is there in that? And in fact, these claims, as set out in the homilies, as well as the Mandaean and the Johannite view, matches more or less perfectly discoveries and conclusions that New Testament historians and scholars have made in the last half century or so. But as usual, this information hasn't yet trickled down to rank and file Christians, and probably never will. This is just a traditional depiction of the relationship between John the Baptist and Jesus. This is by Verrocchio, and the two angels there are the first known pieces of work by Leonardo da Vinci, who was an apprentice to Verrocchio at the time. That's the only reason I put that one up. So in the early Christian sources, there's very little to go on where John is concerned. He appears very briefly in the New Testament Gospels, and his role is really confined to really being a kind of warm-up man for Jesus. He stirs the people up with his calls for repentance and preaches the imminent coming of one who is greater than him. And then when Jesus appears on the banks of the Jordan for baptism, John proclaims, that's the one he's been talking about. And then he kind of basically falls at his feet, declares his unworthiness, and then kind of fades out of the story and doesn't really play much part in the rest of it. We're told that shortly after baptising Jesus, he's arrested on the orders of Herod Antipas, the ruler of Galilee. And later we're told, almost as an afterthought, that Herod has had John executed by beheading, apparently as the result of being tricked into it by his wife and daughter. And that's it. That's all the information the Gospels give us about John. But at least it tells us that the start of Jesus' own mission was connected in some way with John the Baptist and this kind of endorsement that he'd given him as the one. But a bit of detective work, we can flesh the story out a bit, particularly when you compare it to the writings of the Jewish historian Josephus, who came from the generation after Jesus and John the Baptist. From this we know that John was actually a major religious figure in his own right, who was immensely popular with the people. He spoke with authority. Josephus writes that he commanded Jews to mend their ways and to accept baptism, and that the people were, in his words, excited to the utmost by his teaching. And in fact, according to Josephus, that's why Herod has John arrested and then executed, because he's afraid of the hold that he has over the people. He fears that John has so much power over them that he's going to do something, in Josephus' words, radically innovative, i.e. something revolutionary. But perhaps most significant for us in that account is what he doesn't say about John. He doesn't say anything about him preaching the coming of one greater than himself. And yet, according, of course, to the Gospels, that message about the coming of the one greater than himself is the very core of John's preaching. So it's very clear that John is an important figure in his own right, with his own movement, with a core of disciples and a popular following. It's also clear that Jesus started out as a member of that movement, a disciple of John's. Certainly an important disciple, perhaps a leader of the disciples, a similar role to that Peter had in Jesus' following. Even as his designated second in command, who would take over if anything happened to John. Well, of course, something did happen to John. And it's also very clear that first John's arrest and then his execution had major impacts on Jesus' own career and led to his emergence as a teacher and a leader in his own right. But a very important point is it's clear, even from the Gospels, is that the reason people, at least in the beginning, listened to Jesus and followed him was because Jesus himself portrayed himself to the people and to his own disciples as the person who was continuing what John had started and was going to complete what John had started. He was John's successor. He'd inherited John's authority. But although he owed his own authority to John, Jesus also appears to have been struggling to free himself from John's shadow. Certainly not all of John the Baptist's followers accepted Jesus as the new leader. Even the Gospels record disputes between Jesus' disciples and John's disciples about points of teaching. But not only did not all of John's disciples switch to Jesus, John himself came to have doubts about Jesus. Gospels of Matthew and Luke relate that when he was in prison, John managed to get two of his disciples to take a message to Jesus, the question, are you the one who was to come, or should we expect someone else? So the question is, if John is being divinely inspired to recognise and proclaim Jesus as the one, what had happened? Why was he now unsure if he'd been right to begin with? The obvious answer to that is because Jesus must have been doing something different to what John had expected of him. So although Jesus presents himself as the person who's continuing John's work, he must have departed from John's teaching in some way. He must have changed something about the message or the objective. Otherwise, we can't explain why at least some of John's disciples didn't accept him as leader, and we can't explain that question that John asked from prison. And actually remember the Mandaeans' belief that Jesus, in their words, perverted John's message. Now, the rivalry between the two groups of disciples survived both John's execution and Jesus' crucifixion, even in the Acts of the Apostles, on two occasions that, as Paul is going around the Roman Empire preaching, he actually encounters communities of followers of John the Baptist, who'd already been converted by kind of apostles of John. Interestingly, that come there from Alexandria. There's always this connection with Alexandria. Don't know why, but there certainly is. And when Paul encounters these communities, another really significant thing is that they are followers of John the Baptist, but they have no idea that he's preached the idea that there's somebody better, there's somebody more powerful than him is coming along. Clearly, the apostles encountered by Paul belong to the same sect as described in the Clementine homilies. But just to go back to this claim in the homilies, that the John sect were using John's own words to justify their beliefs about, using Jesus' own words to justify their beliefs about John, actually turns out to be true. There's an important recent discovery of an original version of the Gospel of Matthew that actually predates the New Testament version. This version's been around for a long time. It's actually a version that was written in Hebrew, Matthew's Gospel written in Hebrew, that circulated among Jewish scholars in Spain in the Middle Ages. But it's always been thought, not unnaturally, that it's a translation of the New Testament version. But actually recent studies have found out that actually it comes from an original that predated the New Testament version. And again, very briefly, although almost all of this Hebrew version of Matthew is exactly the same as the New Testament one, there are a few differences, and those differences only make sense if it's the New Testament version that's changed, not the Hebrew. There's a few examples of that. But the significant thing for us is that all those changes relate to John the Baptist, and in particular Jesus' words about him. Two really key ones. In the conventional Matthew, Jesus says that all the prophets and the law prophesied until John, which is fair enough, meaning prophets and the law means basically the scriptures we call the Old Testament, and Jesus is saying that the prophecies started to be fulfilled when John came along. So they prophesied until John. In the Hebrew version, it says, Jesus says the prophets and the law prophesied about John the Baptist. Not until, but all these scriptures, the ones that give the signs by which the Messiah will be recognised, were talking not until John, but about him. And the other change is in the conventional Matthew, Jesus says that John came to restore all things, which is a kind of vague statement that can be interpreted in many ways. In the Hebrew version, Jesus says that John came to save all the world. In other words, Jesus was proclaiming John the Baptist as both Messiah and Saviour. So that now we understand why those early Christian writings said the John sect were using Jesus' own words to support their claims that it was John the Baptist was the Messiah, the Christ. But it was the early church that changed those words, that changed the Gospel of Matthew, because they had to downplay the importance of John the Baptist and his influence over Jesus. And in fact, they reversed the position entirely and put words into John the Baptist's mouth to make him declare himself inferior to Jesus. The early church had to do it for two reasons. First is that their own words, Jesus' own words, were being used against them by the followers of the other Christ, John the Baptist. And of course, the other more important reason for them is that those words undermined the church's own claims about the special nature of Jesus. So effectively, if we believe not just the Johannites, whether we call them Dosithians, Simonians, Mandaeans or Templars, but Jesus' own words, his own original words, actually been worshipping the wrong Christ for the last 2,000 years. So it all fits together into a very clear and consistent picture of a heretical movement, a form of Christianity but with a different Christ that's been around for 2,000 years. And you know, between all those groups, we have to explain how those beliefs came to be held by people and groups in Europe. And logically, it's when the Johannite tradition left the Middle East and entered into European underground traditions, would have happened during the time of the early Crusades, which is exactly what the esoteric legends relating to the Templars and the Johannites of the East tell us. And all of this was unlocked for us by paintings such as this one, by Leonardo da Vinci, which are perfect encapsulation of the beliefs of the Johannites. And so now I shall hand back to Lynn for the grand finale.
Yes. When we wrote Templar Revelation, rather po-facedly when we were talking about this, we said something like, oh, well, not just this painting, we talk about his general attitude. We said, you know, he was a joker, but he never did the equivalent, a childish equivalent of sticking a red nose on St. Peter. And that was really po-faced. And honestly, we hadn't seen it. Then one day, your friend Lynn saw it. And I'm going to show you, but first of all, I'm going to say that it doesn't say much about me being probably, as far as we know, the first person for 500 years to notice this. And I'll explain. So, right, first, before I do the big reveal, remember that I said this was commissioned by a bunch of monks called the Confraternity of the Immaculate Conception, which no doubt gave Leonardo an idea. And basically, as I said, they commissioned Leonardo to basically paint this scene. They also, by the way, gave him a frame, an old frame to put it in. But those were just the two things. After that, it was up to him what he did. The whole idea of the rocks, the inclusion of the rocks, was his. And, you know, there's quite a lot of them, aren't there? Yeah, now, if you're in any doubt as to what Leonardo thought about the Holy Family, let me show you. There's one fine testicle. There's a vein going right up the middle. And there's a little spurt of weeds coming out of the top. Once you see that, gentleman and lady, you will never unsee it. And believe me, you'll never unsee it. And it's also in the London version, but that's slightly different, but it's there. And, you know, I mean, basically, he's saying she ain't no virgin. It's coming out the top of her head, or as we would say these days, dickhead. But there's also, I mean, you know, if you really look at this, there's sort of ladies' bits, and there's a hand, and there's sort of a bum with things sticking in it. That's what he thought of them. I mean, Johannite, but vicious with it. And that's, I mean, so now you understand when we go into galleries and, you know, we see people standing in front of Leonardo's beautiful religious paintings, and they're all practically in prayer in front of them. I mean, come on, boys and girls. I mean, you know, so, and also, you know, if I ever say to you, let's go and laugh at the Leonardos, you know what I mean. So thank you.